Well, I think we're about ready to get going. Happily, our speakers have both arrived, and we've beaten the weather so far. Cross your fingers, we won't have to invoke our escape plan, though that would be an interesting story. Welcome to SMU. Welcome to the Security and Strategy program here at the Tower Center. We're very pleased that you're all able to join us tonight. It's a terrific crowd. We were just talking about the sort of variety of people who are interested in these issues. Students, faculty, people from the media, people from government, people from business, people from law. Everybody is represented here tonight. And I think that speaks not only to the importance of the issue, but to the quality of our speakers and the quality of their work. So welcome. This should be a captivating evening, very interesting talk. The Security and Strategy program here at SMU focuses on two big questions. We always ask two big questions. How do you win wars and how do you win the peace? Right? That is, how do you think about the application of armed force to achieve political objectives? The strategy question. And then how do you consolidate your wartime gains for a more peaceful, prosperous, stable future? The security piece. In Iraq, the United States hasn't been able to find good answers to either question. In 2003, it rapidly toppled Saddam Hussein's government, but it soon faced an insurgency against the fledgling new government, and very soon after that, a very confusing and bloody civil war, as many upstart groups vied for power in a country where the political order seemed up for grabs. Most of these groups failed. Most insurgent groups, most terrorist groups, most arms groups failed in this contest. They were either destroyed, or they were disbanded, or they were co-opted by some of their larger rivals. ISIS has been an exception. ISIS has been quite successful compared to some of the other groups that have been fighting in Iraq and then Syria. Last summer, it rapidly took over vast stretches of Iraq and across the border in Syria as well, much to the surprise of Americans, most of whom knew very little about ISIS if they had ever heard of it at all. ISIS was shocking not only for its success, its rapid battlefield gains, but for its brutality. It wasn't just succeeding on the battlefield, it was splashing gruesome videos on the internet. It really did shock the conscience in a way that other groups did not. And the rise of ISIS was shocking for yet a third reason, because the Iraqi army seemed to just dissolve in its path. Critics reasonably asked why this happened, why the Iraqi army seemed to fail so dramatically despite billions of dollars in U.S. aid and many years of U.S. training and support. Tonight we're here to address both sides of this issue. Why did ISIS do so well? Why did Iraq fare so poorly in response? These are big questions. These are big, complex questions. And in fact, they're too big to understand from any single perspective. So, as is our perspective here in the Security and Strategy program, we've sought out experts from very different walks of life that can help us understand these questions by looking at them from different directions. On my left is Joby Warrick of the Washington Post, a Pulitzer Prize winner who has written two extraordinary books on the U.S. war on terrorism. The first, The Triple Agent, described an al-Qaeda suicide bomber against the CIA in Afghanistan. And the last book, the recently released book, is called Black Flags, which details the rise of ISIS and which will be the focus of his talk tonight. It's a very long career at the Post. I think you've been there about 20 years now, and is a real leader in national security journalism. Dr. Kate Talmadge, on my far left, is assistant professor at George Washington University. She is a political scientist who has written widely on U.S. defense politics, U.S. foreign policy, and strategy in contemporary American wars. She is the author of The Dictator's Army, Battlefield Effectiveness in Authoritarian Regimes, which is a truly path-breaking book. It tells us a great deal about how armies fight historically and in the current day, and it also, I think, is going to be one of the key works on civil-military relations for a long time forward. That is, how do military leaders and political leaders interact, and how does that interaction affect wartime results? Dr. Talmadge is also the author of U.S. Defense Politics, The Origins of Security Policy, which came out in 2000. The second edition was 2014. I think it's now in its second printing. What we will do tonight is Joby Warrick will speak for about 20 minutes on ISIS. That will be followed immediately by Caitlin Talmadge, who will speak for about 20 minutes or 25 minutes on the Iraqi response. Right? Hopefully at the end of their commentary, we'll have some idea about how we got here, how we got to this moment, and maybe it will generate some ideas of what comes next. How, if at all, can the United States respond to this program? Before I turn it over to our speakers, one last item. You may have noticed there's a book table. Both books are on sale right now. Buy many of them. Buy as many as you can fit in your bag. The authors will also be quite happy to stick around afterwards for book signing if you'd like them signed after you buy them. So without further ado, welcome once again to SAS at SMU, and please join me in welcoming Joby Warrick and Caitlin Talmadge.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Hope you guys can hear this okay. If not, just give me a hand signal. I'll speak up a little bit. I'm glad to be here in Dallas and not in the Middle East tonight. It's been way too much time there. And I apologize for keeping everybody waiting. I've had a really, really crazy day. We had a family medical emergency, and I won't go into all the gory details, but I had to go up to New York last night and was there almost all night. And everything turned out fine, so I was able to rearrange my flights. But literally got in about an hour and 15 minutes ago with nothing but sneakers and jeans. So I had to, among everything else, had to find a place and buy shoes, belt, jacket, shirt. And I'm noticed I still have tags on, so I had to explain my strange appearance here. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's ISIS, but since the book came out, it's just been 6 weeks I've had to deal with a funeral in the family, this little deal. And the craziest one was I was in Louisville about a week and a half ago, and was getting ready to do the talk, and suddenly my phone starts going off, and it's Politico and it's a bunch of organizations wanting to know about the Benghazi hearings with Hillary testifying. Well, it turns out that my name had come up for some reason in the hearings, and they wouldn't know if I had a comment. I had no idea what story they were talking about, and whether I was a hero or a villain, and I had to go through the entire evening before I could figure out, it's just some stupid story I'd written years ago that somebody decided was relevant, and they brought it up. So I think ISIS, I just have this ISIS cloud in my head, and I'm just ready to move on to something else. So I'm just showing, my pictures aren't so dramatic, but just to being a newspaper guy, I love images, and so it's always good sometimes just to see or get a sense of things we're talking about. I'm going to start with a true story that's actually in the book. On June 10th, 2014, the day that Iraq's second largest city fell to an ISIS army, I happened to be in Jordan visiting with the head of Jordan's counterterrorism division in his office, just a few hundred miles from the fighting. The Jordanian officer was Abu Haytham, and he's a hard man, a brigadier in the intelligence service, a veteran interrogator who specialized in breaking people. I describe him in the book as having the personality of an anvil. The intelligence service has a bit of a rough reputation as well. The headquarters building is famous in Amman. Its nickname is the Fingernail Factory. But as the two of us are sitting there that morning, watching the ISIS victory parades in Mosul on his office TV, I could tell that he was deeply worried. He fidgets with a pair of prayer beads, and he says nothing for a long time. All around us in his office, aides are scrambling to keep abreast of events and tighten controls on the border crossings, because now Jordan has two borders with ISIS, one in Syria, one in Iraq. And we're watching this endless loop of images of victorious ISIS fighters waving and grinning for the backs of pickup trucks with their black flags fluttering behind them. The scenes being played out on TV are both unbelievable and profoundly disturbing. Just a year earlier, ISIS had seized territory in Syria for the first time, taking over desert towns in the fringe of the country, far from Damascus and far from the power centers of the Syrian government. 12 months later, ISIS was blitzing across western Iraq, capturing cities and towns and pushing back U.S.-trained Iraqi regulars. In Mosul, an assault force of 1,500 ISIS militants had routed 4 Iraqi divisions in 4 days. And I think Caitlin's going to talk a little bit more about how that happened. But what was amazing about that was not just that they had succeeded, but what they had captured. They had now huge stores of food. They had entire military bases. They had 4 divisions worth of military equipment, most of it U.S.-made. So this was a disaster on an epic scale. And there were actually, and the other very sad part of this were there were volunteer recruits, and we kept hearing about these people coming in from Western Europe and the United States, and now more than ever because ISIS was on a roll, so it was this huge influx of guys coming from places like Germany and France and again even the United States. And as bad as it seemed to everyone else, no one was in bigger trouble at this moment than Jordan, with this small, moderate Arab country, a great U.S. ally, that now faced the grim prospect of having ISIS controlling border crossings and highways on two sides of its border. So the man next to me was worried, all right, and yet oddly he didn't seem surprised, and I asked him why. He said, unfortunately, from the beginning there has always been this potential. The rest of the world was waking up that June morning to the spectacle of a vicious terrorist organization seizing essentially a country. And soon the world would witness ISIS's stunning barbarity, the beheadings, crucifixions, the immolations, and the stonings. It was shocking, but it wasn't new. Abu Haytham and his countrymen had been fighting the same gang under different names for decades. It was a containment effort for them and a constant struggle that ebbed and flowed. And every time this country seemed to be getting things under control, someone from outside the region would do something rash and make things 1,000 times worse. But the situation had never been as grim as this. Look how fruitful they had been, Abu Haytham told me, looking at the images on the screen. We worked so hard to stop them. They always get sick, but they never die. My book is a story of origins. I don't pretend to offer solutions or even a clear view where this is going, which made the conclusions of my book a little bit easier to write. But the book is essentially a character sketch. It's a narrative of events and personalities behind ISIS's founding generation. Though ISIS appeared to most casual viewers to come from nowhere, what we witnessed on television screens last summer was just the flowering of a jihadist movement that even 15 years ago was rejected by Al-Qaeda as being too extreme. So the backstory starts with Abu Musab Zarqawi, an uneducated, unaccomplished thug from the streets of Zarqa, Jordan, who embraced an austere vision of Islam and pioneered many of the tactics that ISIS uses today, from videotape beheadings of young men in orange jumpsuits, that was Zarqawi, to shocking displays of violence against ordinary Muslims in their mosques and schools and markets. It was this man who first managed to bring together disaffected former Baathists and radical Islamist fanatics to form this highly effective stew, this insurgency that existed in Iraq that was remarkable in its discipline, its willingness to exact terror on local populations, and also its organizational talent and strategic cunning. The book portrays Zarqawi as an original and indispensable force, that ISIS would not exist without Zarqawi. And it argues that Zarqawi, as we came to know him, would not have existed without the Iraq invasion and occupation of 2003. So all these events come together. It also shows that Zarqawi's successors today are remarkably faithful to the vision and tactics of the founder. So if you want to understand the goals and ambitions of this organization, this is a very good place to start. So briefly, who is this man, and to what extent are his ideas and innovations part of today's ISIS? Well, this photograph just confirms, the little guy in the front there is our man, that even terrorists start out as cherubic toddlers. I won't go into a lengthy biography except to say there's rarely been someone more unlikely as a candidate to lead a terrorist organization. The young Zarqawi was not just unaccomplished, he was a loser, a juvenile delinquent, a high school dropout, a heavy drinker, a fighter. He had tattoos on his arms. In his 20s, he has a religious conversion. He goes off to Afghanistan to fight the communists. And he fails even there because he arrives too late to fight the Soviets, which is what he wanted to do. But he does get his card stamped as a holy warrior, a mujahideen, and he comes back home with battlefield experience and a head full of extremist ideology from the contemporaries of Osama bin Laden, so much like the recruits going to ISIS today. The war ends for him, and he's suddenly back in peaceful Jordan, a place where he no longer feels at home. He forms a terrorist cell, starts looking for ways to attack Israeli interests as well as symbols of Western corruption, such as liquor stores and pornographic theaters. Really small-time stuff. One of his comrades is assigned, in one instance, to build a cinema that shows X-rated movies. But when the bomber gets inside the theater, he gets so engrossed in the movie he forgets about the bomb. So he's sitting there, and the thing literally explodes at his feet. Nobody else is hurt. He loses both his legs, and he shows up in another place in the book as you get a chance to read it. Well, eventually the Jordanians get tired of this. They round these guys up. Zarqawi gets thrown into a really harsh prison, and this becomes the second phase of his transformation. In this setting, crowded together very conveniently with other Islamists, about 50 of them all together in one big cell, he's transformed from this Zarqa tough guy into a charismatic and capable leader. And this is where Zarqawi gets the first in a series of incredible breaks. So his prison sentence would have kept him locked away for 15 years until 2009. He would have been a middle-aged man, think about 2009 and where things were then, would have missed everything. But then, abruptly, in 1999, Jordan's king Hussein dies. And in Jordan, there's a tradition, when the king dies, there's a general amnesty that's granted to prisoners, particularly political prisoners. But what they typically do is the parliament and the tribes put together a list, and it all goes to the king for approval, and he signs off on this amnesty. 2,000 inmates are released, and among them are Zarqawi as an entire gang. So all of a sudden, he's out of prison, and he soon ends up back in Afghanistan and goes straight off to try to join up with Osama bin Laden. Interestingly, bin Laden rejects him, because Zarqawi even then was viewed as being too extreme in his ideas, too headstrong for al-Qaeda, refuses to listen and follow directions, and this becomes a pattern that we'll see years later as Zarqawi's fights with bin Laden's, and they disagree even today, the two movements. Bin Laden finally allows him to set up his own camp, but far away, way off in Herat, on the other side of the country. Then comes the other amazing turn of events. So still, at this point, in 2002, Zarqawi is unknown. He has his own network, but he lacks resources, and he's literally at a dead end in late 2002. He's stuck in the remote mountains of northern Iraq, in the area protected by the Kurdish no-fly zone, with Saddam Hussein, who really dislikes these Islamists, on one side, and a very fickle Iranian government on the other. It sometimes helps them when it benefits them, but sometimes doesn't. But then, in just a few months, Zarqawi becomes quite famous indeed. That's because on February 5 of that year, Secretary of State Colin Powell stands before the UN Security Council to make the case for a military invasion of Iraq, and he cites Zarqawi by name. Powell shows the UN this slide, which purports to illustrate links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. The man at the top of the chart is Zarqawi, an obscure terrorist at that moment, but the embodiment of this claimed connection between the Iraqi government and Islamist terrorism. There are two problems with the claim. One, as we all know, was that it was inaccurate. And the CIA, to their credit, were actually saying at the time, we don't really think there is a connection between Zarqawi and Saddam Hussein. They really hate each other. There's no evidence of a real tie. But the administration made a case, and they made it for the UN. Well, the second consequence was that suddenly Zarqawi is not an obscure terrorist anymore. He's the toast of the jihadist world. And overnight, it becomes a sensation, and people all around the world who want to do something in Iraq, who are looking for a way to fight the Americans, start signing up. So you get recruits coming into his camp, you get a lot of money coming to his camp, and then when the U.S. invasion takes place a few months later, something that Zarqawi always predicted would happen, he was going to have a big fight with the United States, he was going to be in Iraq. He is in Baghdad, not al-Qaeda, not bin Laden. Zarqawi and his network quickly move into Baghdad to wait for the Americans. The missteps of the occupation have been dissected, by many people, but how did this trained, uneducated Jordanian manage to exploit them all so effectively? And what lessons did the current leadership of ISIS absorb and incorporate into the successor movement, ISIS? So a couple of insights. One is this jihadi mystique. That's actually Stan McChrystal, the general that finally was able to capture and kill Zarqawi. I'm sorry, spoiler alert, but that happens halfway through the book. But charisma is a trait that is more particular to Zarqawi, as I show in the book, and because charisma obviously is something that can't be acquired or learned, much to the regret of some U.S. presidential campaign managers at the moment. But what distinguished Zarqawi back in his prison days even was this combination of street credibility, tough guy swagger, and genuine charisma that made him intensely popular among his core followers, and then helped his rise later to the top of the jihadist universe. Even in prison, there was this profound personal magnetism that causes Zarqawi to be thrust into the leadership even over his mentor. So within this prison society, there's a guy who's really the sort of the head of the group. He's a scholar, he's written books, his name is Makdizi, he's got all these credentials, he's got this polish that Zarqawi doesn't have, but the inmates don't really care about him. They like the tough guy. They like the guy who gets things done. So when there's a fight in the prison, Zarqawi's leading the charge. When somebody gets hurt, Zarqawi's the good general who looks after his troops. So he is the one that kind of attracts loyalty, and then this becomes his calling card. And later on, I think it's an interesting contrast between the images that bin Laden was putting out at this time, this ponderous old man with the long beard and the dyed beard at that, trying to kind of cover up his age, versus this Zarqawi who was this man of action. Zarqawi's first video, interestingly, the first time he showed his face, although he actually had a mask on, was to take an American hostage and cut his head off on video. And the second time we see him, he's doing things like this. He's got Nike sneakers on and a ninja costume. He's shooting a machine gun up in the air. And I've been struck that even after his death, years after his death, when you read about these young jihadists around the world and who they idolize, there was a Canadian diplomat named Robert Fowler who was kidnapped in 2008 and held hostage for 130 days. He writes this remarkable memoir about his experience. And he tells a story about how there'd be a video night among the jihadists that he was with, and they'd put a laptop up and they'd show these videos. And the thing that really got him riled up was not bin Laden and his sermons, but this guy Zarqawi who would shoot his machine gun up in the air, he would kill Americans. And this was caused great admiration among these young men in Africa that wanted to fight jihad. And today, Zarqawi's image is part of ISIS's literature. They pay homage to him, and he's still quite the hero. So there's a couple other things that are interesting about Zarqawi's movement that's distinct from bin Laden. I think I skipped it. No, there we go. And that is, bin Laden had this sort of universal Islamic appeal. This was a Sunni movement, but he wasn't picking, he wasn't picking fights on Shia. He wanted popularity. He wanted to be liked by Muslims around the world. Zarqawi didn't care. He was a man of the tribe. He was uneducated. He kind of came from this tribal background. These are actually his parents. They come from this town where everybody is part of the tribe and your identity is part of the tribe, and those who aren't part are outsiders. So he was very comfortable with the idea of killing people who are not part of his clique, part of his group. Strategic, cunning, bold action. Zarqawi was not an educated man, as we've seen, but somehow, with his helpers, clearly many Iraqis helping him out with this, he managed to build a formidable intelligence, logistical, and operational network inside Iraq. And he went on the attack in the summer of 2003 with precision and purpose. His first major attacks in Baghdad in 2003 were against Arab embassies, the United Nations, the Red Cross, other NGOs, then against iconic Shiite individual leaders and establishments like great mosques. And you all are familiar with these images and stories from a decade ago. And all of it to provoke a high level of outrage. Former CIA analyst Bruce Rydell describes his methods this way. By attacking the UN, he drove out all the UN, the non-governmental organizations, and discouraged anyone from opening an embassy. Then he went after the Shia-Sunni fault line with attacks on Shiite mosques. So first he isolated us, drove everybody else who could have helped us out of Iraq, and then he put us in the middle of a civil war. This is a very, very deliberate sequence of events. Then later, Zarqawi begins to embrace violence for his own sake, seeking to shock and inflame in a systematic way to incite ethnic violence and to rip the Iraqi society apart at the seam. He describes his philosophy in 2004 in a letter to Osama bin Laden, and he says this: "The solution that we seek is for us to drag the Shia into a battle, because this is the only way to prolong the fighting between us and the infidels. The only solution is for us to strike the religious, military, and other cadres among the Shia with blow after blow until they bend to the Sunnis. Someone may say that in this matter we are being hasty and rash in leading the Islamic nation into a battle for which it is not yet ready, a battle that will be revolting and in which blood will be spilled. This," Zarqawi says, "is exactly what we want." Then, moving beyond mass casualty attacks, Zarqawi was the first to really grasp that no bombing could summon up the kind of visceral horror of a single, brutally intimate execution. And so in 2004, he kidnapped an American civilian, a guy named Nick Berg, businessman from Philadelphia, who just happened to be in Iraq trying to drum up some business. And he dressed him in an orange jumpsuit, and then he beheaded him with his own knife. And then he distributed that image across the world, pioneering the tactic that ISIS so famously employs today. Zarqawi also understood that horror can be amplified on a massive scale using the internet. So the images of Berg's murder, first of all, were broadcast around the globe at a moment in time when broadband internet is becoming available in millions of homes around the world. Al-Qaeda used the internet as well, but delivered messages and encouragement in the form of long sermons. Zarqawi used the internet to shock and intimidate using the most horrific images available. And ISIS, with its embrace of new social media, is taking that same model to a ghastly new level. Finally, the caliphate. This is something that was also innovative about Zarqawi and different from bin Laden, and actually different from most of the Islamists that we read about in the Middle East. Everybody embraced the idea of someday having this caliphate, this idea of restoring this mythical Islamic society that to them existed up through the end of the Ottoman Empire, really existed in its heyday, about 1,000 years before that. But so the idea was to try to recreate this society, but everybody just assumed it would take place in the future. Bin Laden thought you have to get rid of the Americans first, you have to push them out of the Middle East. Other people had different notions about having to overthrow Arab governments. But Zarqawi was different. He said what you have to do is just do it, declare the state, and it'll come, kind of like a field of dreams. And the way you make that happen is just act as boldly, and in this case as brutally as you can, not looking to be popular, but just to make things happen, to shake things up. And so really for him, this building this Muslim society by tearing apart the old one, by erasing these boundaries that he believed as being part of an illegally partitioned Middle East. This was both the ultimate goal and the immediate goal. And the way, again, to make this happen was to act boldly now, believing that faithful Sunnis would rally to the cause and Allah would decide the outcome. He never lived to see this day, though he predicted that it was soon at hand. Just after his death, his successors rebranded the organization as the Islamic State of Iraq, declaring the establishment of a caliphate that existed at the time only in the minds of Zarqawi's most zealous followers. 8 years after Zarqawi's death, almost to the day, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, today's leader of ISIS, repeated this declaration, not from hiding, but from a mosque in Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, which a small ISIS army had captured in less than a week. In his speech proclaiming the birth of the Islamic State, Baghdadi paid tribute not to bin Laden, but to the movement's crude, uneducated, pathologically violent founder, whose words and images are everywhere in ISIS's literature today. Baghdadi said, "This is the state for which Sheikh Abu Musab al-Zarqawi paved the way. It will not retreat in any shape or manner from the territory to which it has been extended." More than a year after that statement, in spite of months of bombings and attacks by a coalition that now includes Arabs, Russians, Turks, Iranians, and Americans, Zarqawi's successors are still refusing to retreat. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back here, and I think Joby has given us a great series of insights into the origins and the development and the objectives of ISIS in the Middle East, and some insight into why they've had the successes that they've had. But as he also noted, the flip side of ISIS success is also Iraqi failure in stopping their expansion. And I'm sure many of you, like me, probably remember a day last summer where you woke up and opened the newspaper or turned on your computer and saw a headline like this about the collapse of the Iraqi security forces in the face of ISIS advances, particularly in Mosul. And as Joby mentioned, these advances were nothing short of stunning, especially for those of us who might not have been following some of the gains that ISIS had made in western Iraq earlier in the year. The fact that this very small, seemingly obscure band of fighters could essentially in a matter of days take over Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, a city of 1.4 million people, is absolutely remarkable. And if you were like me, your reaction to seeing this sort of advance was to be just stunned and say, how could something like this happen? Because on paper, if we look at the organization that Joby was just discussing, ISIS, and think about its comparison to the Iraqi security forces that the United States had spent $25 billion between 2003 and 2011 training, it's really amazing that the force on the right couldn't beat the force on the left. We were talking about, I think you put the number of 1,500 fighters that ISIS brought to Mosul as compared to about 4 Iraqi divisions that were in the area, so that's about 40,000 soldiers on the Iraqi side. The ISIS fighters, for the most part, were just a light infantry force with small arms as compared to the Iraqi security forces, which, as Joby mentioned, had American equipment and weapons, including armor and air power, that could have been brought to bear on the situation. ISIS was based at the time, and still is to a certain extent, in Raqqa in Syria, giving it a very long supply line between its headquarters, where it was based, and the fight in Mosul, as opposed to the Iraqis, who were fighting on their home turf. You're talking about Iraqi soldiers defending their wives and children who lived in the city very nearby. And of course, ISIS was politically isolated in many ways. No one has been a fan of this group, and that really stands in contrast to the Iraqis, who were allied at the time not only with the United States, but as many of us here know, with Iran as well. So two of the largest powers in the region were backing the Iraqi security forces, and yet still this happened. And so the question is why, and what I'd like to do in our discussion tonight is give you some sense of what I think the answer is, at least part of the answer, based on some of the research that I've done, including the work in my book. And the simple explanation, the relatively simple explanation I would give is that this is a story really about Iraqi politics, and specifically Iraqi civil-military relations. That is, the place of the Iraqi military in society and its relationship to Iraq's political leaders and Iraq's citizens, and how the nature of that civil-military relationship actually undermined Iraq's ability to generate the combat power that we would have expected it to have based on all of the advantages that I just mentioned, all of the resources. In short, Iraqi civil-military relations undermined the country's ability to generate military power from the resources that it possessed. And to make that argument, I'll just kind of move in three main steps. First, I just want to elaborate on the point I just made about Iraqi civil-military relations, give you a little bit of sense of the background that goes into that claim, what it was about the nature of the relationship between the military and society and political leaders that led to the Iraqi collapse. Second, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since the collapse. I think Joby gave us some really fantastic context, kind of the history leading up to the collapse, and I think there's kind of the natural follow-on question, which is, well, what's been going on since Iraqi forces failed? What's the United States been doing? And then lastly, I'd like to kind of broaden out to some of the larger implications that I think the study of the rise of ISIS and the collapse of Iraqi security forces have for U.S. policy in the region and perhaps U.S. strategy more generally in the world. So if we're going to think about Iraqi military collapse, it's important that we actually be a bit specific about what it is that we think the Iraqis should have done in places like Mosul and elsewhere in Iraq in the face of ISIS attacks that they didn't do. What does it mean to actually be effective on the battlefield in this sort of situation? And this is a topic that I address in great detail in the book, and I'll give you the Cliff Notes version here, which is that to be effective on the battlefield, armies need to be able to generate operational and tactical fighting power from their resources. And to do this, they need to be able to perform three critical tasks. The first task is that they have to be able to put together motivated, cohesive military units full of people who are willing to stand and fight in the face of resistance from an adversary. So you've got to have people who are motivated, they're not going to desert, they're not going to defect. Secondly, those people need to be endowed with basic tactical skills. They have to be tactically proficient in things like weapons handling, marksmanship, the ability to use terrain for cover and concealment, the ability to construct effective fighting positions. And third, they have to be able to take those skills at the small unit level and aggregate them into the performance of what I call complex operations. Complex operations involve more skill, more initiative, more coordination. They frequently involve two or more types of combat arms, so combined arms activities. So for example, an air unit and a ground unit coordinating together to conduct close air support. That would be an example of a complex operation. Infantry and armor working together to conduct a maneuver operation. That would be an example of a complex operation. And they can be defensive as well, conducting a fighting withdrawal, conducting a defense in depth. These are complex operations that we see effective militaries able to perform. The critical takeaway from this is that Iraqi civil-military relations, as I'll discuss in just a moment, undermined Iraq's ability to do each of these things in some pretty specific ways. And I think that was really critical to understanding why, despite Iraq's material advantages, it wasn't able to perform very well in Mosul and elsewhere. So when I mention this Iraqi civil-military relations, the relationship between the Iraqi military and its political leaders and the place of the military in society, it's important to step back for a moment and realize that when we think about the place of our own military, the U.S. military in society, we need to remember that many countries are not actually set up the way the United States is. In fact, when we think about our end of the military and what the military does, its role in society, its relationship to political leaders, our military is basically largely, not entirely, but a largely apolitical institution that goes other places to fight the bad guys. It's an apolitical institution that deals with external adversaries. This is not how all or even necessarily most countries see the role of their military. And in fact, it was certainly not the way that things worked in the Iraqi military. In the Iraqi military, it was a deliberately politicized institution that at times evinced more politics than professionalism. And specifically, the Iraqi military throughout its history, not just recently, not just in the time of Saddam, but going all the way back to the period of British rule and the Hashemite monarchy, it has been an institution whose primary purpose is use by whatever group is in power to systematically and violently repress other groups in Iraqi society. This has been its major function. At the same time that leaders have used the military to do this, they have also feared the military because the military, as the most capable institution in Iraqi society at almost any point in its history, has always had the ability to potentially overthrow Iraqi leaders. And in fact, Iraq, its history is littered with more than a dozen coups and coup attempts between 1936 and 1979. One of the earliest sets of coups brought to power a guy named General Qasem, obviously a military officer. He himself was eventually overthrown by a coup after several attempts in the 1960s. He was overthrown in 1963, but he escaped an earlier assassination attempt by a 22-year-old Ba'ath Party apparatchik. Does anyone recognize this guy? Very good, yeah, okay. So a young Saddam Hussein, so you can kind of see where Saddam himself cut his teeth in all this. So Saddam, his party comes to power in the late 60s. He eventually ascends to the top political position in Iraq in 1979, which, as you'll notice, is when those coups mysteriously stop. And one of the reasons that they stopped once Saddam came to power is that he was very effective in using the military to go after his political opponents, which were mostly Shia, because Saddam, as we know, was a Sunni. He was a minority ruler over a large Shia population, and one of the first things he did was to round up his Shia opponents, jail, torture, execute them. Many of them fled into exile, including this guy. Can anyone guess who this is? This is a tough one. Yes, okay, very good. It's Nouri al-Maliki. Nouri al-Maliki's formative political experience was fleeing Saddam Hussein's Iraq and being persecuted by Saddam's Sunni Ba'athist security forces, and he spent much of the period between 1979 and 2003 outside of Iraq, hiding from them. The United States, of course, as we know, comes in 2003, gets rid of Saddam, holds elections. Iraq is a Shia majority country, so Maliki, his parties do well, Shia parties do well, he becomes the prime minister. Unsurprisingly, Maliki does not turn the Iraqi army into a little American army that's an apolitical force that goes abroad to fight external adversaries. Instead, he does exactly what all Iraqi political leaders have done with their military, which is to use it to violently oppress other groups in Iraqi society, and of course, to protect himself against the possibility of coups, because at the same time that he's using the military, he's afraid of it. And so we see Maliki engage in a series of politicization measures toward the Iraqi military, which very systematically undermined the combat power Iraq was able to generate. So to give you just a quick sense of what I'm talking about, two of his key policies involved exclusion of Sunni fighters from top positions in the Iraqi military, and a deliberate decision not to integrate a number of Sunni fighters, particularly from Anbar province, into the Iraqi security forces after the US leaves in 2011. He also systematically uses Iraqi security forces to violently repress Sunni political dissent, again, mostly in Western Iraq, which unsurprisingly leads to Sunni military units in the Iraqi army that are not very interested in defending his regime. So in Mosul, the 4 divisions of the Iraqi military that were supposed to be defending that city were largely manned by Sunnis. Unsurprisingly, when they see ISIS at the gates, it's actually a tough call for them to say, do I fear ISIS more, or do I fear Baghdad more? Do I want to lose my life for Baghdad? This regime that's oppressing me won't let me advance in the military, is rounding up and killing my relatives, or would it be better to just lay down my weapons, take off my uniform, and go home? And I think we know how many people answered that question. So we see how some of this politicization directly undermined one of those first key tasks I mentioned, generating soldiers who are motivated to fight. But I think Maliki's politicization went beyond that. He also took a number of other measures, including carefully controlling and in many ways corrupting the officer promotion process so that only his cronies, people who were politically loyal to him, were running military units, and also denying training and equipment and weapons to units like the Sunni units in part in Mosul that he feared might actually turn on him. Unsurprisingly, if you have incompetent, corrupt officers and you don't encourage training because you're afraid that it might lead units to turn against you, or you don't give them weapons because you're worried that they might use them against your regime, you're not going to have particularly tactically proficient units. And this has been one of the big problems that we're continuing to see, as I'll discuss in a moment. Lastly, Maliki systematically made efforts to prevent coordination and information sharing across different units in the Iraqi military, again, because of a concern that the same sort of planning and coordination that could lead to combat proficiency and the conduct of those complex operations I mentioned could also easily enable conspiracy and coup plotting against his regime. And so we see how he's kind of continuing in the same vein that we saw other Iraqi leaders pursue throughout Iraq's history. But in combination, these sorts of politicization measures really, I think, shed some light on why it was that despite Iraq's tremendous material advantages, when ISIS comes along, it actually is able to achieve some surprisingly effective combat results. And so, given all of that, I want to talk a little bit now about the second thing I mentioned, which is just what happened after summer of 2014. We know that the Iraqi military had a pretty systematic collapse. What's happened since then? As I think most people in this room probably know, the United States has responded, I think, with really a two-pronged strategy. The first involves air attacks, an air campaign by U.S. and coalition forces to go after what you can attack from the air, which is largely supply lines and visible concentrations of ISIS forces. So these are things like trying to break the supply line between Raqqa and Mosul, trying to stop infiltration of fighters and men and material into Western Iraq, and so forth. And secondly, there's been this idea that air power is going to work in coordination with ground power, and that the ground power is going to be provided by local forces. And some of these have been Kurdish, but there's also been this important emphasis on training, or in this case retraining, I guess you would say, Iraqi security forces. Out of the approximately 3,500 military personnel, and that's in addition, of course, to all the contractors and non-uniformed personnel that are in Iraq right now, a substantial fraction of them, about 450, are trainers. But as the United States has gone in and tried to build up Iraqi ground power to assist in this campaign, it made very clear last summer and fall that Maliki really had to go, and there needed to be new Iraqi political leadership that was going to avoid some of those politicization measures that I already mentioned. And so Haider al-Abadi, also a Shia, but supposedly of a different stripe, comes in and replaces Maliki. Some people are optimistic for a little while, but as we've heard more recently in testimony from senior American civilian and military officials, this is General Lloyd Austin, who's the commander of U.S. Central Command, testifying just a couple months ago, the results have been incredibly disappointing for the resources that have been put in. Out of the 250,000-man Iraqi army, we basically have seen training for about 13,000 soldiers, and most of those actually have not been soldiers from Baghdad. They've mostly been Kurdish soldiers dispatched from the Peshmerga forces in the north. And the reason for this, again, is the same set of themes. It's because Baghdad doesn't really want some of these Sunni units in particular to be very well trained. And so politicization is persisting. The training effort has been slow. We've actually seen ISIS continue to gain some ground in places like Ramadi, which was taken back earlier this year. It's important to note, though, that ISIS is not taking ground in places like Ramadi because it's a 10-foot-tall, invincible fighting organization that can never be defeated. And in fact, ISIS has lost ground over the last year at the hands of forces that are not drawn from the Iraqi military. So Iranian-backed Shia militias, known as Popular Mobilization Forces, have in tacit coordination with U.S. air power actually taken back some important ground, including Sunni cities like Tikrit, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown. And also we've seen some really pretty impressive successes by Kurdish forces in both northern Iraq and northern Syria, pushing back on ISIS advances. And in fact, I'll show you the map again in a moment, but with the help of Kurdish forces, that supply line between Raqqa and Mosul actually has been cut. So we've seen some successes there. More broadly, though, I want to kind of pan out and just tee up a couple questions about the larger implications of what's been going on since the collapse and what that kind of means going forward. I think we're likely going forward in Iraq to see what military strategists will call a herding stalemate, a situation in which I can hurt you, you can hurt me, but neither of us can decisively defeat the other. So I think we're very unlikely to see a repetition of last June, where ISIS is going to make enormous, rapid, shocking territorial gains, because I think a number of things are kind of pinning them down now. We're not going to see these big convoys, I think, running out in the open in Iraq, because those are the kind of targets that American air power is incredibly good at finding and destroying. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to see the Iraqis planting the flag of victory, because the Iraqi military is still unwilling to do the sorts of things that you need to do to conduct those effective, complex operations that can actually evict ISIS defenders from places where they're very dug in with good urban defenses, like in Mosul. I think because of this, the United States is starting to begin a search for alternatives to the so-called Iraq First strategy that it adopted or announced last summer in response to the ISIS advances. The idea being the United States would concentrate on evicting ISIS from Iraq first, because, as Joby pointed out, that really is where ISIS's roots are much stronger. The United States, I think, in many ways is turning reluctantly to cooperation with other regional and global powers who share the anti-ISIS agenda, which includes Russia to a certain extent and definitely Iran. We're seeing the United States engage in more support of other non-state groups, so not the Iraqi army, but finding ways to funnel weapons and training to Sunni Arab tribes, to Kurdish militias, and to the so-called ever-elusive moderate Syrian opposition, which we can talk about in the Q&A. And lastly, I think it's also leading to the increasing pressure that we're seeing for the American ground presence, because the whole idea behind the American air campaign was air power is going to work in coordination with ground power. Those two are mutually reinforcing, and ground power will be provided by locals. That effort, that prong of the strategy, has proven disappointing, and that's why you're seeing creeping escalation of the U.S. ground footprint, both in Iraq and, as we've seen this week, in Syria. More broadly, I think there's a couple takeaways from the experience we've had training and retraining the Iraqis. The biggest one is that, I think as students of American foreign policy certainly know, it's really hard to train local allies when they simply don't agree with you on what the biggest threat is. When a local ally, as in Baghdad, believes that the biggest threat is internal, or it's a different internal adversary than the one that the United States is trying to combat, there will never be perfect alignment on what you're going to design the military to do. And we've seen that with Maliki, we've seen that with Abadi, and as I discuss in my book, we've seen this with plenty of other instances where we've tried to train foreign militaries, including the very long, very expensive U.S. effort in South Vietnam, which actually bears a striking series of parallels to current events. Lastly, I think this just raises the big question of what is ultimately worth fighting here and fighting for here, and how hard. What are U.S. goals? Does the United States actually need to decisively defeat and destroy ISIS? Is it enough to contain it? How much blood, sweat, and tears are we willing to expend for that goal? I think we'll probably get into this in the Q&A, but our image of our military, again, is that we can kind of go out, do anything, solve any problem. But when we're working with local allies and local actors who may not share our goals entirely, or our sense of where the biggest threat is, it may be hard even for us to get some of those things done. And so with that, I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, Joby, for fabulous presentations and incredibly provocative ideas. I'm sure there's a zillion questions, and we've left plenty of time for Q&A, but I will take the prerogative and start the question and answer session by asking one of each of you. I'll start with Joby. You skipped one slide. You went very quickly over the slide about ISIS organization. Okay? I'm not going to let you skip over that. So you did a great job of explaining some of the key differences in this group. You've got enormously charismatic, a strange kind of thuggish charisma. That's an important difference. You talked about the ultimate goal of an immediate caliphate. That was different. That was one of the big things that split ISIS from Al-Qaeda. But there's this big puzzle. How did it organize itself? How did these thugs actually manage to get these guys in black pajamas to line up so neatly? And how do they coordinate relatively sophisticated operations? And the question for Caitlin has to do with the role of the United States while it was occupying Iraq. And there's two big arguments about this. One is that we didn't help out at all, because as long as U.S. forces were there in large numbers, Iraqi leaders had no incentives to take their own military seriously. As long as Uncle Sam was offering protection, Iraqi leaders could fall back into their old habits of just thinking about their army as being their own personal guard. The other argument, of course, is that as soon as American leaders left, as soon as American forces left in 2011, that opened the door for ISIS. Right? They left the door wide open for a powerful group to take large amounts of territory fast. So the real problem was not the U.S. being there; it was the U.S. leaving. And I'd just like your general thoughts on where you come down on that debate.
Yes, I did take out a slide there. I'd actually shown some of these images to another group, and I was thinking, maybe a little wonky for most people. Logistics tends to make people's eyes glaze over. But it was actually very, very important. It was important even back in Zarqawi's time, because here's a guy who was an outsider. He came from Jordan. He wasn't Iraqi. He came from tribes that were related, so he had some friends and cousins and others that he was able to network with. But he very quickly was able to connect with these disaffected Baathists who were former politicians, former colonels, majors, people who were fairly senior in the Iraqi military, and put them to work in this really impressive logistical operation, which included things like getting recruits mostly from Syria. They had a pipeline going from Syria into Iraq, in which thousands of guys came in, and not just fighters, but suicide bombers. There's a really sophisticated setup to take care of them, to make sure they're properly trained. They were housed differently from anyone else, so they wouldn't be continuously indoctrinated before they went out on their mission. They usually never saw any Iraqis until it was time to go out and kill them with a bomb. And then just later on, after the Zarqawi generation passed away, these Baathists, these generals, become much more powerful, much more important in the movement. And now you see ISIS paying a ton of attention to small detail, everything from military strategy, but also how do you run a community? How do you make sure that bread and milk are delivered? They're pretty good at that. And it's to their credit. It's one of the reasons they've been able to have such staying powers, because they go to these areas. They're not well liked, that's for sure. We've seen plenty of evidence for that. But they do, purport to run government. And so this is one of the things that's fascinating about them and different from other groups that we look at.
So, great question. Of course, you put me on the horns of a dilemma. This question about the U.S. role, and did the U.S. do too much or not enough? It's sort of like the old Woody Allen joke, like the food is terrible and the portions are so small. That's kind of how I feel like people look at the U.S. role in the Middle East. So it's terrible. Why aren't you doing more? And I think the U.S. In a certain way, I think, faced the same moral hazard problem in Iraq that it faces in any situation where it has a large security presence, which is exactly as you say. On the one hand, the presence is there to try to build up local forces, but on the other hand, by being there, in some ways you shield the regime from the problems that it really should be forced to confront. And I think the U.S., in many ways, did have an aggressive training effort, particularly after 2007, 2008, but it was at times, I think, way too focused on how the training effort looked on paper. So did we have the right number of units, were the right number of soldiers, had they checked the box that they had been through training, had the right amount of equipment been dispersed, and so forth. But it's to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the politics, stupid. It's the politics, dummy. If you don't get the politics right, all of the effort to build the military doesn't really help too much. And I think that was kind of the problem we had, was that even though we built the army to a certain size and trained it, a lot of the underlying work to rebuild Iraqi politics wasn't necessarily coming along. And I don't know if that work really could have been done. But I think because it wasn't, when the U.S. left, literally overnight, we see Maliki taking measures to turn back the clock and essentially, restore the Shia to as much political power as he possibly can. He reneges on promises to include the Sunnis in the security forces. He issues an arrest warrant for the Sunni vice president, I believe at the time. He makes it very clear that despite whatever progress the U.S. has made, that Iraqi politics are fundamentally still very divisive, and he's going to use the military the way Iraqi leaders always have. So if more political work had been done while the U.S. had been there, maybe when we left, things would have been different. But as things stood, when the U.S. left, I think in many ways, Maliki acted exactly as we would expect, I think, any Iraqi political leader to have acted based on the country's history prior to that time.
Okay, we do have microphones coming around, I believe. And so please raise your hands high and we'll get you. In the back, sir, please.
So nobody's mentioned the name of Russia yet. And obviously Russia really makes this a lot more complicated situation. But looking at it from the point of view of U.S. interests, one can see that, okay, obviously Russia supports the Assad regime. Nobody likes the Assad regime except maybe Russia and Iran. But doesn't it solve a major problem for the U.S.? If Russia goes in there, supports Assad, and manages to wipe out ISIS, that's a good thing for the U.S. It's also a good thing that the U.S. can't be blamed for supporting Assad. I mean, the U.S. has supported lots of brutal dictators in the past. Pinochet of Chile comes to mind. So we're not averse to doing that. But in this situation, we even get off the hook because we're not blamed for supporting a brutal regime. Russia is. But meanwhile, Russia does the dirty work of getting rid of ISIS, and the body bags are going back to Russia, not to the U.S. So isn't that a good strategy?
Quick thing first, I'm sure that Caitlin will have a much more finely nuanced answer to mine. I think what's happening now is interesting is the right players are in the room for a political settlement. Where were they 2-3 years ago to kind of bring forces together to have the political settlement that would have prevented the situation we're in right now? But it seems to me that everything the Russians are doing is in many ways inflaming the situation. I don't think they're committed enough to really retake Raqqa or any other Syrian cities. So they're essentially making the moderate Arabs very angry, making the Saudis angry. It's and it's making the ISIS folks pretty happy, at least in the sense that they're putting out tons of literature and propaganda right now saying that the Russians are back, come help us, and this is part of their propaganda appeal right now. It appears to be effective. They want this big fight, and they sort of prophesize that it would happen eventually.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Would it be terrible if I pulled up the map really quick? Sure. Could I do that? Let's just see if we can. Because I think it's easier to answer with the map. So I absolutely share your instinct that the United States should be thinking in the big picture here. What are our core interests? Is it more important to us to defeat ISIS or to have good relations with Russia? I think another big question that the Obama administration asked, for instance, is in dealing with Iran, is it more important to have the Iran nuclear deal, even if it's going to upset the Saudis and the Israelis, or is it which set of relationships is more important to manage? So I think your instinct is absolutely right, and in many ways, I understand kind of the logic of your argument. The United States is floundering, trying to find some secular leader that can unify Syria. If only there were such, a leader, right? And many would say, the Russians would say certainly that Assad is that guy, although even they have wavered a little bit in the last couple of weeks about whether preserving Syria means preserving Assad. I think the one problem with the logic that you pointed out, this notion that we can basically kind of look askance as Russia conducts its campaign in defense of the Assad regime and destroys ISIL, is that Russia is not actually going after ISIL or ISIS that directly, because ISIS is not the most threatening force to Assad, and this is why I actually wanted to pull up this map. So if you look over here on this far western part of Syria, this is where the big Syrian cities are besides Damascus. Basically the regime controls a line right along here on the far left side of the country.
and it's retreating to this enclave right here, which is where two big cities are, Tartus, which is where there's a big Russian naval presence, and Latakia. And the real reason I think that the Russians have intervened so heavily in Syria is that Assad has been losing ground right around here, and it looked like the opposition forces were coming to get him and coming in this is basically the Alawi heartland of Syria. It's the richest area of Syria. It's where Assad's family lives. There was actually an amazing Frontline documentary last week. They're still building resorts in this part of Syria. This is a completely different part of Syria from what you see on the rest of the news. But the forces that were encroaching here were not ISIS forces. Those forces are out in the desert here at Raqqa. They're getting pounded by the Kurds from up here and from over here. These forces in here are what we might call the Army of Conquest. This is the new name of these forces, which is, I encourage you to Google it. It hasn't gotten very much play in the US media, but they call themselves the Army of Conquest. And it's basically a big cauldron of non-ISIS forces that want to go after Assad. And it includes Al-Qaeda, it includes a whole bunch of jihadi groups, and it also includes the elusive so-called moderate Syrian opposition. All of these forces have basically been unified under this name. They are funded by the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and tacitly probably by the United States. And so those were the forces that were really threatening Assad, and those are the forces that the Russians are coming in to defend Assad against. So in essence, by turning over Syria to Russia, we may save Assad, but we would also be destroying these forces and not really dealing with our ISIS problem. And I could go on and on about issues related to that, but I think that's the crux of the matter, is that we don't necessarily have only an ISIS problem. There's also this other set of fighters.
Yes. There's a mic coming around.
Well, first of all, thank you two very much for your presentations. I thought they were very insightful. My problem is that following this, not like you have, but over a long period of time, I think that our strategy, participation, or whatever you want to call it, has been a total fiasco. I mean, total fiasco. And even shameful. Okay? And I don't think, and it looks like we're recommitting. You know, we have, 3,500 troops in Iraq and going up, and we just committed some ground forces training, we say, and all that kind of stuff into Syria. I think we have to go for a political solution, and I don't think there is a political solution for Iraq as we know it, or for Syria as we know it. I think we have to rethink, the whole thing, and I'd be interested in your comments on it. I don't think, on a macro basis, we can prevail. I don't think we can.
Can we respond?
Yes.
So I have very similar instincts. I really question whether we can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I don't know that we're ever going to see the reemergence of Iraq and Syria as we knew them with their previous borders, for all the reasons that you identified. And I think this is why it's really important to decide what is good enough. Are we going to continue to play Team America role police and think that we have maximalist goals everywhere that we intervene, or are our stakes here and our interests here more limited, such that we don't have to pursue the goal Obama set last summer, which was to say we were going to decisively degrade and defeat ISIS. Although I think he qualified it and said ultimately defeat ISIS, so maybe that means very long term. Is it enough to contain them, for example? Can we actually live with some of the areas that they're occupying right now and accept that as long as they're not exporting fighters to the West to conduct terrorist attacks here, which I think continues to be the core reason that we're concerned about this problem, is that good enough given what the alternatives are and the escalation that would be required to even have a chance of decisively defeating them, and all the problems that you pointed out might come from that?
It's interesting that one of the motivating factors for Zarqawi and for ISIS today was to erase these historical boundaries in the Middle East, and most of you may know this, but a lot of these countries didn't exist until after the First World War, and the British and the French really took a map and carved up the region and created countries that didn't exist before. And to people like Zarqawi, this was an abomination. This was the original sin, and they were out to erase these boundaries and hopefully create this big unified caliphate. But it's sort of de facto, it's happened. Now there's this kind of interesting little muddle between Iraq and Syria that ISIS somewhat controls, and there's a Kurdish region and a Sunni region and a Shia region, and they'll never be separate states, I don't think, because it's too difficult. There's too much political resistance and diplomatic resistance to creating new countries. But in a way, it's happening as a matter of policy.
Certainly the Kurds.
Certainly the Kurds.
Okay, why don't we come over here? So right down the second row. Your hand up there.
You mentioned earlier that one of our problems is that we don't agree with our allies what the threat is. And I think if we draw back a little bit and look at the broader Middle East, that what's happening is a cultural religious war
between the Shia and Sunnis, and it's happening not just in Iraq and Syria, it's happening everywhere. And so how well are we agreeing with our putative allies, the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and people like that? And will we ever agree what the ultimate goal is here? Because I don't think their
objective is our objective.
So, by the way, that's a great question. Unfortunately, we're having some feedback problems. So, if I could just ask speakers just to speak up, and maybe we'll go off mic. And if people can't hear the questions, we'll repeat them before the answers come.
So I agree with the gist of your question, which is that we, have a fundamental set of disagreements about what the threat is, and there's the question, I think, all along of whether we fully understood the lens through which others, particularly our allies, but also our adversaries, are looking at the region. If you can bear with me, I just have one other map that I think speaks directly to your question, and I almost used it in the talk, and it's this map. So this is the map without the borders. This is basically ISIS and the people trying to contain ISIS. And I think it speaks very much to the way people in the region look at it. Like, it gives you a very good sense of why the Iranians are supporting Assad, just as an example. And so I think there's that dynamic, but I would note that I think it's not just a religious Sunni Shia thing, because, for instance, many Kurds are Sunni Muslims as well, but some of the fiercest fighting that we're seeing right now is between Kurds and Sunni Arabs in places like northern Syria, because Kurds are coming down to kick out ISIS, and at the same time they're wanting to keep the land that they have, and the Arabs are saying, wait a second, this is Arab land, this isn't Kurdish land, right? So there's a religious component, but there's also a sectarian component. There's still a nationalist component there. And so all of these, I think, help explain why it is so hard to have local allies who are going to see things exactly the way we do. The truth is, you never have local allies that see things 100% the way you do. But the question is, how big is the divergence? And we do have cases, rare cases, but we do have cases where I think the United States has had successful occupations and training of allied security forces. If you think about after World War II, for instance, think about the US role in Germany. What was one of the big reasons for that? Well, common view of an external menacing threat, right? The Soviets. That really helped to get the US and the Germans on the same page real quick. And we just don't have that here for all the reasons that you mentioned.
In fact, sometimes we have the opposite. So the Turks finally get involved and do some airstrikes, but really go after some of the Kurdish groups that are helping us. And it just there are layers and layers of complications. It just makes Hillary Clinton's line about the Syrian conflict, it's the problem from hell, and it's no exaggeration. It's just it's incredibly complex.
Okay, we'll come over here, sir, please.
There was some talk of containment as an option. Step back, let the problems stay where they are. Is that possible or feasible, given Turkey's role as essentially the doorway to Europe? There's so much at stake there. Can it be kept stable?
In my discussions, and I wonder if Caitlin's hearing the same thing, containment is not dismissed in the way that it was a year ago. And when talking to some of the regional groups, the Iraqis don't seem that big of a hurry to do anything about retaking Mosul. I don't know if they have there's nothing on the drawing board. There's this talk last year there's going to be this great offensive in the fall, but that didn't happen. And other countries like even the Jordanians have a lot at stake here. They're just pretty much settling into the fact that they're going to have to deal with this for a long time. And containment may be the best issue because there's just no other way to go. It's a little bit, not just a little bit, it's a hugely scary proposition because the one real problem with a group like ISIS is the fact that, they were bad enough when they were in a relatively, in a country that had a government that functioned, talking about Iraq here, and a military presence that was significant that could keep them on their heels. But for them to have a safe haven, and not just a safe haven, but a place where they have quite a lot of assets, including oil wells and military bases. I mean, it's if they're thinking long-term about attacks on the West, they've got a heck of a launch pad for that now. And anytime you have a terrorism and a failed state or a security vacuum, it's a dangerous proposition.
Ma'am, right here, please.
I've heard two military leaders speak lately at different meetings, and they say since there's nothing in Washington right now but ineptness, that they really just need to send the military straight over there and extinguish it.
Would you repeat the question?
So the question was, there are some people suggesting that the United States should just send a large force and, as you said, extinguish them. Is that possible? Is there a brute force option for the United States?
I mean, there's always a brute force option for the United States, but the question is, do we believe that the costs of that option are worth paying? And I think in this case, the costs, just in terms of civilian casualties, and you forget the U.S. image or the military costs or economic costs, I think would be very hard for the United States to justify and to bear. Because remember, the United States is already doing the things you can do from the air as far as going after those supply lines and going after concentrations of forces. But where ISIS is really dug in are in these big cities, places like Mosul, places like Ramadi, where they have built in, very sophisticated, well-designed urban defenses. And, for those in the room who study military history, I mean, the battles to retake places like Mosul, if we did, a house-by-house sort of clearing, I think would be on a par with Stalingrad in World War II or the Battle for Hue in Vietnam in 1968. I mean, this would be really serious fighting that would impose a lot of U.S. casualties, even if we didn't do it in the way that we usually do it, which is to be really sensitive to civilian casualties. So the option is always there because the United States has a lot of material power, but I don't think we're willing to exercise that power in the way that you described. And even if we did, aside from the civilian issues, I can't even imagine the level of backlash strategically that would create for the United States in the region if we did do that approach. I think it would be unimaginable.
Yeah, that's no small thing. Even the allies that in the region that are most worried about ISIS don't want us there on the ground, because the one thing it succeeds in doing is unifying all these various groups. They have a common enemy. It's just as most of you know, there's this big rift between ISIS and Al Qaeda, and they're actually fighting each other in some cases. And Zawahiri, the leader of Al Qaeda now, had a recent statement a few weeks ago, which he continued to say that he doesn't recognize the ISIS caliphate as legitimate. Baghdad's not really the caliph. On the other hand, he said, which is kind of striking, is if I were in the region now as an Islamist fighter, I might join ISIS because they're this big fight against Russia. So it's time for us to all combine forces. And so there's this, at least a prospect of getting these two groups on the same page, which is pretty terrifying. So there's always unintended consequences, and this is going down a very slippery path.
In the front, please.
I wanted you to comment on the ISIS forces that are now showing up in Afghanistan and North Africa. Are they large? Are they supported from the central area where ISIS is? And what can be done about that?
Yeah, I think to me this is one of the most disturbing things that's happening right now, because it's actually since even before ISIS came on our radar screen for most of us. So this black flags, idea, and the idea of not going after the far end but creating this sort of state at home was being picked up by all these regional groups, and even groups like AQAP, Al Qaeda, and the Arab Peninsula started taking more sort of the ISIS approach. And now you're seeing there's at least 10 different countries now that has a significant ISIS presence or a local version of it. And they don't appear to be coordinated that well. There's some statements of support. There's propaganda that's issued that suggests there's some very like-minded ideas, but they're not really coordinated. But I think that even if ISIS in Syria and Iraq are contained, then you still have these burgeoning movements in Africa in particular, but also other parts of the world. Afghanistan, there's a new ISIS organization there. That's a much harder and much longer term problem, I think, for us.
Right here, sir, please.
This is probably for Professor Talmadge, but it seemed like the military going into Iraq did a tremendous job, won the war very quickly, and then everything seemed to go off the rails. Could you comment about some of the key things that were done wrong? Were we turning over the government too quickly to the Iraqis? I know there was a huge push to get it done, get them to take over. And were we not putting enough pressure on the Iraqis to have the kind of government that would merit the support of the people and that would have avoided a lot of these follow-up problems the way that MacArthur did in Japan or we did in Germany?
You also know more about that if you want to.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, well, so I think it's always tempting to, and we should, look back at history and say, what could we have done differently? Was there a way to make a different outcome possible? I'm actually very skeptical that there was a good way to invade Iraq in 2003 and overthrow Saddam's government. As evil of a dictator as he was, I think we've come to slightly appreciate his ability to keep Iraq together today, perhaps a bit more than we did at the time, because it's actually really, really difficult, and that's why he did some of the things that he did. Not justifying it or excusing it, but just saying we've clearly learned that the problem he dealt with of maintaining a unified Iraq under a government in Baghdad is actually really, really hard. If I could more directly answer your question, though, I think three of the biggest mistakes that the U.S. made that I think in hindsight an optimist would say we definitely should have done these things differently. I would say one was rapidly disbanding the military, which sent out to the ranks of the unemployed many Ba'athist military officers who, if I'm not mistaken, went on to become some of the key figures in the evolution of ISIS, exactly as Joby mentioned. And that's part of the reason I think, as a side note, that ISIS is so extraordinarily effective just in combat terms, because there actually are some military professionals who have joined the ranks. The second thing is that even in the nature of the rapid conventional advance that you mentioned, so the military victory that we achieved so rapidly in 2003, paradoxically, the very rapidity of that advance and that victory in Baghdad, I think, left behind a great deal of resistance that also became some of the seeds of the insurgency. So the U.S. military strategy really was designed to make a lightning rush to Baghdad to bypass pockets of resistance. It was supposed to be an exemplar of maneuver warfare, which it was. But the problem, I think, is that it didn't necessarily deal with all of the resistance that maybe a slower advance would have, and maybe that would have made things easier. The last thing I would point to is just the decision by the United States, kind of as you hinted, to hold elections very rapidly before institutions had been built. When institutions are not well developed, when democratic institutions are not well developed, and there was no reason to expect them to develop rapidly in Iraq, and you hold elections, all elections do is reify sectarian divisions. And they also raise expectations for the people, for their needs to be met, and for democracy to come, and those expectations can't be met. So it really sets up, I think, some fundamental problems, and we've exactly seen that, the majority Shia elected Shia parties. You have a Shia prime minister. What does he do? He uses the institutions of the state, especially the military, and we didn't even talk about the police and the interior ministry, but it's the same thing, to oppress the other groups in society. It's not to turn the military or other institutions into this democratic model that the United States had in mind. So, elections are not always a panacea if you don't have the institutions to make them work.
Just real quickly on that, I totally agree with everything there, and just also you can never just forget that the other side gets a vote too, and Zarqawi was incredibly effective in capitalizing on all the mistakes that we made, and even on the thing with the first first polls, the first election in Iraq. There was a lot of pressure within the administration. Let's get this election done. Let's have a legitimate elected government in Iraq. And Zarqawi said, oh, yeah, but we're gonna scare all the Sunnis and make sure they stay home. And they were very effective. It was something like 4% of Sunnis in Anbar province came out and voted in that election. So there was an election and there was a democratically elected government. The Sunnis were not part of it. And that created just the seeds for some of the resentments that came later on. And that was a very shrewd manipulation on the part of the insurgency on either side.
Wow. There are many hands up. Unfortunately, we are about out of time. Obviously, there are a lot of questions still yet unaddressed and unanswered. There's a million hard questions in this issue in Iraq, in Syria, and in ISIS. There are no easy answers. I think if anything has come out of that, there are really no easy strategic or operational answers to these problems. But I think our speakers have given us a lot of a very good way of understanding the problem at a deeper level, and perhaps giving us a little more sympathy for the people who actually have to come up with answers to these questions. Before we break, two small items. One, as I mentioned earlier, our speakers are happy to stay around and sign books, and there is a book table on the outside if you'd like to read more about these both fascinating and marvelous books. Remember, Christmas is coming, so you can buy more than one. It is a great stocking stuffer. One other point. Next Thursday here at the Tower Center, we're hosting our annual National Security Dinner featuring General Craig McKinley, who until recently served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's going to be talking about the history and the future of the military-industrial complex. So it should be another fascinating discussion. Please RSVP through our website if you haven't already. And if you are not on our website, if you're not on our mailing list, how dare you? Get on our mailing list. Please send us your email so we can let you know about such great events. Thank you so much for coming and for your questions. Please join me. Thank you.